been said that a good place to make major decisions in life is in a cemetery. It brings perspective. It causes us to step back from the moment and look at decisions from a life perspective. Think about some decisions you've made over the past year. Which of those matter today, in 10 years, or in your lifetime? Psalm 139 reminds us that all the days ordained for us were written in God's book before one of them came to be. He knows how long we have on this earth, whether we are young or old when it happens. It's still a relatively short period of time. My point is, life is a gift from God. Most of us will experience or have already experienced the death of someone very close to us. It's in those moments that we are faced with the reality of our own mortality. Unless Jesus returns in our lifetime, we too will leave this world. The decisions we've made in this life will determine our eternity. Actually, it comes down to just one decision. Am I living for myself, or am I living for Jesus? Matt Accurso experienced what no one wants to experience. Matt lost his wife during the birth of his first son, baby Matthew, and then just 17 days later, he would also lose baby Matthew. In those moments, Matt's foundation was rocked. Up to that time, Matt had trusted God. He trusted that God cared for him and his family. He trusted that God held them in his hands, and he trusted that God's ways were higher than his own ways. Still, he was at a crossroads. Would he continue to trust God and believe that God still loves him, or would he turn away? Well, today I'm joined by Matt Accurso and his pastor, Matt McCloghry. And even through the loss in Matt's story, you'll see that this is still very much a conversation of hope.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Behind the Mic, Conversations of Hope. We are so glad that you are back with us. And as I promised last week, we have a very touching and unique story that we want to share with you. So I would like to welcome, we got two guests today, which is exciting. This is the first time we've done this. We want to welcome Matt Accurso and Pastor Matt, who are joining us from sunny Florida. You can see I've got my hoodie on here, and they're in short sleeves. So I should have done this in person. I don't know if I can expense that or not. I don't really have a business. So anyway, Matt and Pastor Matt, thank you guys so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
You're so welcome.
And as I mentioned earlier, Pastor Matt he's from Australia. He's got the accent to prove it. And I've always admired that. I've always wanted to try and have that accent. So maybe I'll pick some of that up through this interview. So, Matt,
I'll be happy to do some coaching as well. I'll offer some coaching for you.
So we'll have a podcast next week on coaching to speak like an Australian. That would be fun. Matt, I don't even want to step on your story. I just want you to share. You have had an amazing journey. And Pastor Matt has been there kind of to walk through it with you. So that's why I asked both of you to come on, because Pastor Matt's got a little bit of an outside perspective on looking in on this situation as it unfolded. And so I think we'll start off with just Matt, if you want to share your story with our listeners. It was so heartbreaking for me to see this on a video. It was actually a newscast that I ran across, and I was just dumbfounded. But then there was hope in it, and that's what made me contact you both. So, Matt, you want to share your story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And just to start off, really do appreciate you having us on, and I want to start just by saying that, oftentimes, because I'm the one that was kind of went through it, and my wife passed and my son passed, but and oftentimes the focus is on our family. But I will say, we could not have done it without Maddie, his wife Jill, our church, our community. There's so many people that have been involved in this story. And so we have not done it alone. And we're so thankful that we have not had to do it alone, because whenever anyone goes through any certain amount of grief, we've got to lean in to our community, our friends, our church, our support, the people that love us, the people that want the best for us. And I think ultimately, God has that structure set up around every single person, no matter who you are. You have someone that you can lean on, and maybe those relationships may even be strained, but then I know that God intends to repair those relationships and create bridges with those relationships. And sometimes the single purpose of a point of grief is so that relationships are built and restored. So in saying that, as I speak, there's a group, a cloud, whatever you want to call it, of people that have stood by us and stood the test of time. And to me, that's one of the greatest things on the face of the earth is people who stand the test of time with you. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how crazy that storm gets, they're like, we're not going anywhere, And so Pastor Matt, it's weird calling him Pastor Matt. He's one of my best friends, but he's been there since the beginning, and even before, like I say the beginning, I mean like before any of this happened, we had a friendship. And then his wife Jill went to school with my wife Lauren, so then, and they literally were like knew each other when they were, 6, 7 years old. So they've known each other pretty much their whole lives. So the story is beautiful. There's a lot of details and threads that we may miss, but I feel like that's a really important one, is like God establishes, and he not only establishes when the grief happens, but he establishes long before grief ever happens, long before tragedy ever happens.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. So I think, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of like go like flash style through it, because there's a lot of details. And then if you want to hear about something specifically, we can talk about that. But ultimately, my wife, Lauren, and I, we would have been married 16 years. And in April 29th of 2019, we were getting prepared to have our baby boy, Matthew Jr., come into the world. And I remember the day. I mean, it's like, it's so clear, like not a detail is missed from that day. I remember racing home because my mom called me and she said, hey, it's happening. So like anybody would do, like pedal to the metal all the way down this certain street that gets to our house. And I got to our home, and my wife, Lauren, is sitting on the back porch. And, when she was pregnant, like we always say, like she was pregnant, like her belly, if she, like you saw the back of her, you would not know she was pregnant. And then she would turn to the side and just be this massive, like, look like she was having triplets all the time.
No hiding it.
Right? And no hiding it. So she's sitting on the back porch and just preparing like she always does. I mean, she was just such a calm, even keel person, like in the face of birth, which, I would be flipping out, and she was always just calm, even keel. And she was like, it's about to happen, babe. So we head into our room, and everything's just kind of going like we normally do it. We're home birth people. We're like hippie granola home birth people. So we were having the baby at home, and we got in the bed, and everything was going great. And our midwife Tara arrived, and her doula Jamie, and they came in, and I was laying with Lauren. So we were laying on our bed, literally in the room that I'm in right now. And so, just was hugging her and kissing her. And, we were just like talking about like, if she was comfortable and all those things that you do. And at that point, she was ready to get into the tub. So we had a tub set up in our room. And so we got the tub all set up. She got in, and I had to go to the bathroom. So I shot to the bathroom real quick. And then while I'm in there, Tara's like, okay, it's go time. So it'd been about probably 2 hours from what I remember. And I had my bathing suit on. I jumped in the tub, and so Lauren was leaning over the tub, and at that point her mom had her hands, and I had, we were preparing, for Matthew. Like her water had broke. You could see the water was kind of getting a little cloudy. And at that point, it was like a few minutes into it where Lauren just went prostrate. Like, so her legs came out from under her, and her body just went straight. It was so odd, and I had no idea what was going on. I looked at Tara, and I could see on Tara's face, this isn't normal. So, I mean, I literally lifted her and Matthew out of the tub, and like her mom had one of her shoulders, I think Tara had the other. And at that point, something was horribly wrong. So basically, the paramedics arrived, and at that point, Lauren had turned blue, like her color was gone, and CPR was administered, and Matthew was still inside the womb, so at that point he was without oxygen. So I remember, it'll always stick out in my brain, because I was yelling at her to come back, and I remember the paramedics coming in, and it was like a guy that I'd been in high school with, and he just stopped the door, because he couldn't believe it was me, and I couldn't believe it was him. And so then they raced in, got Lauren, and then we shot to the hospital. And it was the longest ride of my entire life. I felt like we were moving in slow motion, and in our neighborhood, our family is across the street, and our Allie, Naomi, and Lane, they had said their goodbyes to their mom that morning, and then we call him Papa, their grandfather, he brought them across the street. So they were across the street when all this was going on. Allie's like jumping on the trampoline, they're playing with their cousins, and we're taken off to the emergency room. So we shot to the emergency room, and I just remember, her color was gone. So what we think happened was, in that moment that she went prostrate, she actually did pass, because there's something called amniotic fluid embolism. So that's what essentially they diagnosed Lauren with, amniotic fluid embolism. And this is important, because I feel like there needs to be more attention around this. There needs to be more research around this. And there's really not. We don't know a whole lot about it. I went through my entire doctorate program, and I only heard about amniotic fluid embolism maybe once. And then I also remember going to a seminar and briefly touching on it. But when you talk with certain physicians and doctors, no one really has a solid answer about what it is. But essentially, there's talk of, there's an allergy that goes on in the body where the woman is actually allergic to the amniotic fluid, and that's what causes cardiac arrest and pulmonary arrest. So, instantly there's a heart attack that takes place, and it can take the life of that mother and the baby pretty instantly. Obviously, the baby's still in the womb, so there's only a certain amount of time a baby can be in a womb without oxygen to the brain, and that's essentially what happened to Matthew. And then also there's talk. There's a lot of attention around a bubble that forms when the amniotic fluid leaks into the bloodstream, and so they say that bubble can also go to the heart and cause an amniotic fluid embolism or a cardiac arrest. Yeah. So, in saying that, there's really no definitive answers right now, and there's researchers stepping up that are saying, okay, this is really what we feel it is, but at the same time, there's no foundation to it. So we need more attention around it. But ultimately, Lauren passed away, and I just remember, being in that little room in that hospital and just hearing the doctor. I mean, I remember he came in a couple times and said, we're still working on her. We're still working on her. I believe that, they knew that she was gone, but they were doing everything that they could to try and resuscitate her and bring her back. The physician that was there, I'll never forget him. He immediately knew that Matthew's life was in danger. So he performed a C-section, got Matthew out. There was still life in his body. So they took him up to the NICU. They had to wrap him in these, he was connected to all sorts of things, monitoring his body, but then they also had to cool his body because he was highly inflamed. His brain was inflamed also because it had been without oxygen. And so at that point, one of the hardest things was, I had my wife in this other room and I wanted to go to her, but then I had a son who may have seconds to live. We just didn't know how long he had to live. And I knew that in that moment that Lauren was going to say, babe, you need to be with our son. Like, don't go to me, go to our son. So, and in that time, like, Maddie had gotten there. I remember him walking in, and I believe he was the first person I hugged when he walked into that small little room, that waiting room. And then I walked out, and it still honestly gives me chills because I know that, Matt was texting and Jill was texting, and then like the text, I think, just kind of went viral, and so what seemed like our entire church was in this small little hallway. And I just remember a ton of people, and the Spirit of God was there in that hallway. The Spirit of God was on that hospital. And I could just feel the Holy Spirit, like, just, he was moving in everything that was happening, all the parts that were happening, he was moving. And I remember I honestly don't remember the walk. I know there was like levels to the hospital, and I got to a really high level of the hospital. I don't remember how. I remember I was walking with, Pastor Bob was there, and his son, and Maddie, and a few other guys, my best friend Steve, and we all walked up to this room, and Matthew was laying in the NICU, and in that moment I just laid my hand on him, and I just prayed like that God do what only he could do, and I prayed miracles over his body, and claimed, all the things that you claim as a father in Jesus' name, that he were to raise Matthew up, that he were to put oxygen back into his brain and his heart, that he were to sustain his body. And what's wild is I also gave him up to the Lord in that moment. I also said, God, whatever you have for this little boy is what you have for him. And if he lives just tonight, then I get just tonight with him. But I'll take whatever you give me. So at that point, I had a group of guys around me, and that was that still means the world to me, because some things were said in this back room that were so crucial to the process that I was going to be going through, the journey that we were going to go through for 17 days with Matthew. Matthew lived 17 days, so he was transferred to Wolfson's, and he was put on, he was wrapped in, he was alive. He did not have to be like resuscitated or anything like that. He had life in him, but at the same time, there were things that needed to keep him alive. He had to have oxygen. He had to have a feeding tube. He had to be wrapped in cooling blankets to keep the inflammation from getting too high. And, so that was a really important element, having those men around me, because some things were said that I clung to, which was, right now it's every hour. It's not about thinking about the next 2 days or 3 days, or even, what's going to happen, to this or that. Like, you're thinking about so many things when grief and tragedy hit, but ultimately it's being in those moments, So, at the hospital, we were there with him for 17 days, and it was some of the most beautiful 17 days that I've ever had in my entire life. And to this day, I'll never forget them. It was like I was with an angel for 17 days. And the hard part was that we could hold Matthew, but it was really difficult because he had this tube going down his throat. So you had to be careful because it could actually hurt him if it went too far down. So we were really careful about holding him. But during that time, Maddie's wife, Jill, and a really great friend of ours, and my mom, and a couple other people that were in the mix were going in and spending time with Matthew. And, Jill would go in and play guitar and sing worship in there. And Charisse would hold him, and Lindsay, our cousin, she was there, and she would hold him. So it was so beautiful to see, like, these women standing in the gap for Matthew's mom. Like she was gone, she couldn't hold him, but God was using these other women to mother Matthew in this time. It was incredible. And during that time, some incredible miracles were taking place. And that's where I would also say, for anyone going through grief or tragedy, like, look for the miracles that are happening in and around that tragedy, because the enemy wants to distract us and wants to, and don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being focused on your needs and your desires, because we all have those when we go through grief and tragedy. But we also know that we serve a really big God, and that he's going to use grief and tragedy to honor and glorify himself. He's going to use the grief and tragedy to save other people. He's going to use it to save you, to save your family, to build bridges. Like, there are good things that are going to come out of the grief and tragedy. And it's so ironic, because then you have this pain, this like pain beyond pain beyond pain. And it's almost like, if I kind of correlate it to, accidentally like nailing your thumb with a hammer, right? When you nail your thumb with a hammer, like, all you think about is that thumb, and you're like, I gotta get where I need to go to get this thumb taken care of. And when you go through grief and tragedy and pain, God wants us to zoom out, and he wants us to realize that there's a lot more at work, and everybody has their own time frame that they go through. But ultimately, some incredible miracles were happening in this hospital. One of them was that there were nurses coming from other floors and other buildings in Jacksonville to come and be on Matthew's floor. And at first it was like, they knew that something was going on. And a lot of the nurses explained it as, I knew I needed to be there. But ultimately we knew that the Spirit was drawing people from all over, so that God could speak into their lives, because God had something to say. And ultimately there were nurses that were saved on that floor, and there were staff that, just were going back to God. They had fallen away, or they had walked away. It's hilarious. Like, Maddie and I have often talked about this one nurse. He was this massive man. Like, he looked like he was in the WWE, and he was the guy who was monitoring Matthew's oxygen and just basically making sure that he was comfortable. And he was going through his own battle being in that room, and struggling and like asking real questions about God. This is a man that sees babies die every single day. He sees families just go crazy in the rooms. He was telling us that there are families that just go absolutely crazy in these rooms, and there's screaming, and people throwing chairs. This is the type of stuff these nurses see every day. And I remember him leaving, and I asked the nurse, where did Scott go? And she's like, he's asking questions to God right now. And ultimately he came back, and we're still in touch with Scott. And he ultimately came back and just had his dealings with God. But at the end of the day, it was amazing, because he said, I have never witnessed God in a room like this before, and that's no credit to us. It's just, I feel the entire time we were open, and we were transparent, and we welcomed the Holy Spirit in that room. We welcomed the Lord in that room. We were like, we need you here. We can have all the fancy equipment and all the fancy doctors in the world, but if you're not here, God, like, none of this matters, and we need you to sustain us. And so he came down on that floor. The Holy Spirit came down on that floor. He leveled everything. And, to this day, there's a lot of people continue to talk about the presence of God that was on the floor at Flagler Hospital, in and around the story. So it really has, there's been so many blessings that have kind of just carried the entire story through, and it's still going, it's still going on. Like, God's work isn't done here. And Maddie and I always talked about from the very beginning, like, this is a catalyst for God to do something miraculous, and he's continuing to do that.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of people listening going, how could you possibly not go crazy in that situation? Losing your wife, your son struggling. And you mentioned, hitting your thumb with the hammer. I think that's a really great analogy, because we don't see, I pray often, God, this is all I know. I don't know what, the big picture is. I read it in your word, but I don't really know it, I've not experienced it. And I think what you're saying is there's a spiritual realm going on behind everything and every day of our lives that we don't always recognize. And it sounds to me like that just came together during that time, that it was so strong that you were sensing that even in that deep grief, which is pretty amazing. And I think it also shows the power of the Holy Spirit in our lives, if we just acknowledge it. Because Pastor Matt, you can speak into this, but I think that it could have been something where you guys didn't allow that to happen, and maybe you wouldn't have experienced that the way you did had you not recognized the fact that there was another dimension to this. Pastor Matt, what was your experience? We heard Matt talk about how you guys met up in the hallway there at this incredibly. I don't think there are words to describe that time in that moment in time in history. What was your experience in all of this as Matt was talking through all that?
Yeah, I think Matt did a really good job of just kind of telling that story. I don't know how you can fit that into 15 or 20 minutes. It was just such a, when we went through that period of time, that 2 weeks or 3 weeks felt like it was 2 years. It was just like such an intense time of, deep in a valley, seeing God move, but, also going through something that was so real. And so, it all just sort of hit us unexpectedly. Obviously, it was so unexpected. And to this day, our church is 7 years old, and, to this day, it's by far and away the biggest thing that's ever happened in our church's history. Just because of the magnitude, obviously, of what Matt went through, losing Lauren and baby Matthew and whatnot, but also the fact that Lauren, like Matt said, is from St. Augustine, and basically best friends with my wife, Jill, and then the two of them, Matt and Lauren, were so treasured in our church and just so loved. And so when this hit, it was like it's like nothing else mattered. People literally came to the church. We had people just in the second auditorium in our church building, just devastated, grieving themselves, trying to work it out. We had to have pastors come and pray with them, and we had worship nights, to kind of work our way through that, because when something like this happens, all you can do is just run to the presence of God and go to Him, because it's so hard. So but going to the hospital, I think Maddie did a really good job of sort of painting the picture there. I didn't really even know what I was walking into. I kind of just arrived and was like, okay, I heard something crazy's happened with Lauren and she's in the hospital. And then it was actually when I walked into that room and I hugged Matt, he told me in that moment that she was gone. And that was all he said. He just said, she's gone. And I just was like, my heart just sank, and I just was like, what in the world? Like, this is, and that's when I felt like I entered into the true reality of what was going on in that moment. But God was moving. It was immediate how quickly the love and the grace of God meets you in your grief. And it was like, and I've experienced that in my own life too, but it was immediate. Like the moment that you felt the devastation, it was almost like immediately you felt the grace of God. And that was evidenced in the people that showed up, the way that that I watched Matt be able to even, draw breath and have conversations and, move through hallways and stuff like that. Like that's God's grace. And then, just watching the church community really rally around the family was just incredible. But it started there, and then it went for 17 days of being in that hospital with baby Matthew and praying over him, and spending time with him, and just believing for a miracle. And I believe we did get that miracle, because we know where he is. That's the ultimate miracle of all of our lives. Is that one right there. And so we got that, but we formed a real bond, and the story's not over too. That's the cool thing about this conversation, is that here we are all this time later, and like we're still in each other's lives, and God's still doing amazing things in Matt's life. He's got 3 beautiful girls. One of them is actually my daughter's best friend now. And those two are inseparable. It's like trying to pull them apart's literally impossible. And so, it's a really, it was horrible to be met with that reality. But, when you trust in the sovereignty of God and you believe that he's in control, that's when it's going to be okay. When you grab a hold of that reality and choose to trust him. And I can confidently say that Matt's done that, and we've been able to see the blessings that come with that.
There are a lot of people. We all grieve. We all lose someone in life. We just talked last week with Stephen Curtis Chapman, and we mentioned his daughter, young daughter, Maria, passing away, and how they dealt with that. When that happens, it seems that you either draw closer to God or you push God away. I'm going to ask both of you if you can explain that to me. What causes someone to push away from God and someone like Matt to draw near to God? Because I think that's the real root of the problem in the here and now, is when we face those extreme moments of grief. What's that turning point? What makes someone turn away from God and someone draw near? We've heard so many people say, why would God allow that to happen? I'm sure that was a question that was asked a lot in your community during this time. Can either of you answer that for us?
I'll let Maddie answer the hard questions.
This is a great question, because I truly believe that that's the choice that you're faced with in these moments. My wife and I have also been through significant grief, and Matt and I sort of share a commonality there. So Jill and I, we lost our first child. A lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences. And obviously we're not going to, this is about sort of Matt's journey, not mine, but I do relate. And we going through this is what I learned, and this is what helps me as a pastor in these situations, is when grief comes, especially in the form of a loss like this significant, is you are always met with a choice. And the choice is this: do I trust God in his sovereignty? Do I trust that he still loves me and has control of my life? And am I going to go in his direction towards him, or am I going to go away from him? I just firmly believe that no matter what happens in life, when God allows crisis, he's inviting us into making that choice. And so for us, for Jill and I, and I've seen Matt do this as well, we made the choice to run to God, and that has now become one of the many foundations, but one of the strongest foundations of our faith today. To answer the question, why do people not make that choice? And this is what I would kind of offer in that, because obviously I'm not inserted into everyone's situation or know what they're going through, but I would say that one of the big questions that we need to leave off the table in times of grief is the question why. And as a pastor, I try to encourage people, don't ask why, just remember who. Because eventually God's going to tell us why it happened. And there's many things this side of eternity that we will never know. And I personally am looking forward to heaven because there's many people that are there already for me that I want to see again. But in the fullness of that time frame, which is eternal, God will reveal all things, to us, and we'll know. So yeah, I think that's the reason. I think people get really caught up in, why did this happen? Why would God do this? Why would even God allow this? And Jill and I think for Matt as well, we try our best just to retain, just try to live in the stream of, God knows what he's doing and I don't. And that's just where we need to be as his children, is not, trying to be dad, but just remember that he is dad. So.
Yeah, that's so true. And I also, as people are going through things like that, I think it's important to realize, and you said it, was you reach that moment where you decide, I'm just going to trust him. Even though it makes no sense, I'm going to trust him. And I think what that means is, for the church in America today, I think it's time to take stock of where we place God in our lives, because when we meet those moments where we have to make that choice, if we're not walking with him, we could turn away. And I think that there are a lot of, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, but I think that there are a lot of people in our country and throughout the world today who would call themselves Christians that really don't have a relationship. So when the world around them collapses, where do they turn? And I think that's kind of a wake-up call for all of us as we hear your story, Matt, is that what really matters is the eternity. We may live 80, 90 years, 100 years, but eternity is a lot longer than that. And I don't know how that fits into the conversation, but I just think it's important to understand that our relationship with God, through the good times and the rough times, it's important to be prepared for those times that rock our world, and that we know where the firm foundation is. Because if we don't, who knows where we turn? So, Matt, talk about how you share this with your daughters when all of this shakes down and you find yourself back home, head spinning, with 3 pairs of eyes looking at you, wondering what's going on. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, I want to say I'm really glad I let Maddie take that question, because that was the best answer I've ever heard.
Very good.
So it's a precious thing when we get to teach our children through pain and grief and tragedy, and I don't take a single moment for granted when I can share with them about the goodness of God, and I can share with them about how awesome their mom is. And that I say that very intentionally, because she's awesome, and she's still awesome because she's in spirit now, and children understand grief and tragedy, I feel now more than ever, way better than adults. We complicate things, and we try to conceptualize, and our minds our gears are always turning, and a child is just, they see things so simply and clearly. So I would even go so far as say they teach me more than I teach them. Wow. And they teach me that we can smile, we can still have joy, we can still have hope, and we still need to have fun, and those things are all really important as we go throughout life, and they can be present along with the hardships and the grief and the suffering. And that's a wild thing to think about, because those emotions are so opposite. I see them as so opposite, but more than ever before, I see they actually go hand in hand. You know, when we look at how Jesus lived his life and how in one moment he's addressing Pharisees and he's, you know, flipping tables and he's going hard after the things of God. And in another instance, he's loving on people, you know, and he's experiencing joy and he's enjoying the moments that are around him. And that is so true of what real life is and what it's made of. And so when it comes to my daughters, you know, I'll give an example of last night because it's so interesting how this happened right before this podcast. So we were getting ready for bed, and my little girl Naomi, she's 8, and I would say she's my empathetic one. She's the one that will watch a movie, listen to a song, and immediately begin to cry and think of Lauren, and want to talk about Lauren, and want to hug, and all those things. And that alone teaches me so much, because I get so caught up in my day about what I need to get done, and, you know, job and dinner and, you know, all the responsibilities that come with being a single dad. But at the end of the day, it teaches me to stop and appreciate God and appreciate the moment, like right now, you know, not thinking about what we have next on the agenda, but just right now. Yeah. And last night, you know, Naomi, she just broke down crying. Like, brushed her teeth, everything was fine. Then all of a sudden walked in the room and she broke down crying. And I said, "What's wrong, babe?" And she said, "You know, I really miss mommy," you know. And then she just started really like heavy tears. And I said, "Well, what do you miss about her?" And she said, "Dad," she said, "everybody has a mom except me," you know. And it and my heart just shattered, you know, in that moment. Yeah. But then it was amazing because I was able to share with her that actually, you know, you have a mom. Okay? It doesn't mean that just because her body's off this earth doesn't mean that she's not still here, but in presence, in spirit, in heaven with the Lord. And at the same time, we were able to process, and at the same time, you don't have a mom on this earth. Her body is gone, yes. But that doesn't mean that she's not Lauren Louise Accurso, your mom, you know. Yeah. So we went through that, but I mean, that's something really, it's a heavy subject because that's a reality, your person's gone. You know, Lauren's gone. Your mom, yes, her body's not here anymore. She's not on the earth. But it's a beautiful thing also when we can talk about the bigger picture, which is there's other children who've lost, you know, there's other children who've lost their entire families. You know, I think about Darfur and I think about genocide and, you know, children losing everyone they have, you know, and how we really sometimes have to pull out of that really finite way of thinking and just say, you know, there's a bigger picture here. God has a bigger picture. But in that moment, you know, we're able to talk about how much God loves her. We're able to talk about, you know, one thing we always say around our house is that every time you get a hug from a family member, that's a mommy hug, because those are her genetics hugging you, right? Yeah. Every time you get a hug from your sister, that's a mommy hug, because you came from her womb, Lane came from her womb, Allie came from her womb. And so every time we love on each other, we can experience a piece of mommy, you know. And that's been really, really healing in this entire journey. And as we live every day out, and, you know, it just, at times, you feel, you know, separated from the missing and the longing, because it just, you go about your day and you get wrapped up, but then at the same time, then it hits and you're like, man, it feels like day one, you know, feels like she just left, you know. But in those times, our family, we take the opportunity, whether it's at the dinner table or at bedtime, we take the opportunity to just let it sit, you know. We don't ignore. So someone starts crying at the dinner table, which happens every so often, we just go there, you know. It's not an inconvenience. It's not let's just go do something fun. it's not, it's about letting those feelings sit, and then eventually they're going to pass through, and we go on to a board game or whatever it is. And then I've also learned that, I don't need to hide when I cry, I can lean in to those emotions, and we can all cry together. And that's a really important processing part for children that I'm really passionate about, just helping men to really lean into that. Women don't really have a problem with it from what I've seen, but men do. We want to like hide our emotions and, everything's okay, and like wipe the tears. Everything's okay. But it's okay that it's not okay. It's okay that you're not okay. Our children need to actually see that things sometimes are not okay, because they're going to see mom and dad lean into Jesus. And in those times, they're going to remember, you know what? I remember dad was having a heck of a time with this, and he just directed his gaze toward God.
That's right.
And I remember the strength and the power that God showed up with in that moment, and I'll never forget that. And that really is, those are the things that mold our children's faith.
So true, and so such great information there. Wow, there is so much I could ask. We could talk for hours. I want to respect your time. I know you guys have obviously have busy lives as well. I want to very much appreciate you guys taking the time out to do this, to share. I know this will impact a lot of people. And what you were saying there about leaning in, that comes right back to where we started from, and that's community, and how important that is. I am, and my wife both are introverts. So we recharge when we're just kind of by ourselves here in our house, and especially for those kind of people, it's important to realize we were built for relationship, and I think you experienced really deep down how important that is. So I want to ask you both as we close here, what do you want to share with those who are listening, whether they're going through grief, whether they have yet to experience grief? Something from your experience in all of this. What do you want to share with those who are listening to encourage them? This podcast is about hope, and you've already shared in this grief. You've shared a ton of hope, and the real hope in Jesus Christ. But what would you both like to share with the listeners, just from your heart?
I'll go first, so Matt can finish. He can be the bookend. But first of all, Mike, thanks for having us on. Honestly, it's such a blessing. You have the best radio voice I've ever come across. It is
It's true.
Mike, can you just text me some lullabies or something like that, voice memos? Because I'll fall asleep.
I'll trade you this voice for the accent.
It's so peaceful, man. What I would say, and I was just, as you were asking the question, I felt like it sort of came to mind. It's sort of a furthering of kind of what I was saying before, but it's sort of my encouragement to anyone that might be facing grief right now, or if they listen to this in the future and they're facing it, and it really talks about hope. For me, is just run to God. And just know from people that have been through this and have experienced grief, when you run to the Lord, you will never be disappointed. And, even if that means that there's a period of waiting on Him, it's still worth it. He will never let you down. He will never back out on you. He's as faithful gets. And I'm reminded of Psalm 5. I think the psalmist says in Psalm 5, he says, "I prepare a sacrifice in the morning and I wait." And sometimes the process with grief, and I know Matt's had many times just sitting with the Lord and waiting on Him, on a porch at home or whatever. But that's been my experience, and that's my testimony. Is me personally, is that you'll never be disappointed when you run to God, and even if that means waiting on Him. He's always on time, and He'll never let you down. So run to Him would be my advice for sure.
Amen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting. I was when you asked the question, I was also thinking about time, and how God says, my times are in thy hands. And meaning our time, my time, your time, our time is in God's hands. And that we never know the last day that we're going to have on this earth, And not to be morbid, but I could leave this call and go on a drive to the bank and I'm gone, And right. I think oftentimes we just live in a world where there's just, especially in America, like we have an answer for everything. We have a fast track something or other for everything. And there's, IRAs and, car insurance, and there's something for every emergency, because we never want anything to happen that messes up our agenda. And I will say, that we live in a world where agendas are messed up all the time, and the ground drops beneath us. And at the end of the day, like what Maddie's saying, it's like, who are you when everything is stripped away? Who are you? Like, are you your house? Are you your bank account? Are you the person that you're with? Our kids are wonderful, but we're not them either. Like, we're God's. We're His. At the end of the day, it's you and Him. And that's the relationship that matters the most. Everything else comes out of that. And so ultimately, just keeping perspective that our worth, our value, who we are, we've got to see it through God's eyes. And ultimately, I would go so far as to say that, when it comes to grief and tragedy, that that's why we're in the shape that we're in when it comes to pain and suffering in our world, is that we do everything that's possibly imaginable to avoid it and cover it up and build walls so that we don't have to experience pain. But in actuality, God shows us through His Word, He shows us that we can go through pain and still be whole and still have joy and still have hope. And there's good things. There's good things in it. You don't have to even make it to the other side, because I'll say there's a lot of great messages out there that are very upbeat, everything's going to be okay. But when it comes down to it, when you go through loss and grief and tragedy, you're going to carry that with you. You don't one day just get over it. That pain, you're going to carry that with you. So we need to be aware that that's a little satchel that we're going to carry, but that there's joy and redemption, and all the wonderful things of God, all the fruit of the Spirit is going to come with you through it. And there's going to be a point where, you are going to be, as you go through it, there's going to be some time that happens where, that what you're carrying isn't going to feel as great, And when we have that perspective, now all of a sudden our faith increases. We're able to lift up our head and realize that this life has so much to offer, and that it's fast. Quoting Maddie's pastor, like Brian Houston always says, life is fast and life is slow. And it's so true. It really is. It's fast and it's slow. Yeah. Because there are times when you're in a season when you're like, this is so phenomenally slow right now. Yeah. I'm there. How am I going to make it through? And then when it comes to our kids, you blink and they're grown. Yeah. But walking through and taking every advantage of knowing that God's trying to perfect our faith through everything that we go through.
Very well said. There's a lot of sermons in this last 45 minutes, let me tell you. Matt Accurso, Pastor Matt, thank you guys so much. This has been a great encouragement to me, and I've heard a lot of things that I'll take with me from here on my journey. So thank you both for taking the time to be here.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate everything. Really appreciate you having us on.
Appreciate you, Mike. Thank you.
The Bible assures us that if we belong to Jesus, we will spend eternity with Him. 1 Peter 1:23 through 25 says, For you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and enduring Word of God. And then he quotes from Isaiah, and it says, For all people are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers, and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is the word that was preached to you. Well, Pastor Matt said it well when he said, when you run to the Lord, you'll never be disappointed. And that's great advice. As young children, we instinctively run to our parents when we're afraid or we're hurt. That's exactly what we need to do with God. I hope to have Matt back on the show again, and so he can share how God continues to work in his life and in the lives of his beautiful daughters. Well, next week, I get to sit down with a legend in Christian music. His song, Rise Again, won a Dove Award for Song of the Year in 1977, which was the same year that I gave my life to Jesus. Even as a 12-year-old at the time, the lyrics of Rise Again impacted me greatly. You want to hear my conversation of hope with Christian music icon Dallas Holm. Be sure to subscribe to the show and tell your friends to listen too. So we'll be back next week. And until then, remember, if your life is grounded in Jesus, even in the darkest times, there is hope.